Have you ever wondered why some people seem completely self-centered? Have you observed how certain individuals react with disproportionate anger when contradicted, as if the world should revolve around them? Or perhaps you yourself feel that overwhelming emotional pain when your desires aren't promptly fulfilled. What I'm about to reveal today could completely change your understanding of human behavior, and especially about narcissism, this phenomenon that we all carry in different degrees. Stay with me until the end, because this information can transform your perception of your own emotional reactions and those of the people around you. The term narcissism has already been widely mentioned in our discussion circles about human character development. We briefly explored its origin and discovered that it implies self-interest, self-importance, and self-adoration, characteristics that we all possess in varying degrees. There are, however, many other manifestations of narcissism, many tricks by which it overrides our conscious intentions, many ways in which it associates with other instincts, and without our knowledge operates our ruin. Today we'll examine the development of narcissism from its earliest stages and trace in detail where it can lead us. Most people, when asked about the moment when a child's mind began to register feelings, thoughts, and emotions, would probably respond immediately and without hesitation, at the moment of birth. It seems the obvious thing to say, but like many other obvious things, such a statement has little evidence in its favor and much that contradicts it. Think with me. Does the act of birth really operate a sudden or miraculous change in the growth and tissues of the body? It's true that oxygen is now absorbed by the lungs, instead of, as originally, through the mother's blood. But the essential tissues, the brain, muscles, and bones, undergo no sudden change. Before birth, they were living tissues, and we know that the muscles were in action as we felt the baby's movements in the womb. We know that the heart was functioning, propelling blood through the child's arteries. We also confirmed this through the stethoscope, many weeks before birth. Why then should we presume that the brain registers nothing before birth? We know, in fact, that it must be partially active, as it's learning to regulate the action of the heart, the child's secretions, blood pressure, and the movements of its limbs. Therefore, we are justified in supposing that it must be capable of registering impressions, even if it is unable to reason or think in a structured way. It's true that at birth the child begins to go through many new and vivid experiences, but this doesn't mean that it hasn't had any experience in the womb and that these experiences haven't left impressions on its brain. Let's explore for a moment what impressions it probably received and registered. First, it would certainly hear sounds, the sounds of blood rushing through the mother's arteries, and sounds from the outside world, muffled and indistinct when they penetrated the maternal body. All these sounds would be soft and whispering in nature, and those caused by blood in the mother's arteries would have a rhythmic nature, humming, rising, and falling, a kind of lullaby very similar in many ways to the song that the mother hums to the child when she wishes to put it to sleep at a later period. We can expect these sounds to be registered in the child's brain so that, if it ever heard something similar again, some chord of memory feeling would be played and some emotional association would be brought to mind. Second, external movements would be registered in the child's mind as the mother walked, creating a rocking or swaying movement. Again, we should expect that, when in life after birth, the child experienced a similar movement. A chord of memory would be played, and these previous associations would be revived. Not as a conscious memory, of course, but as a deep feeling. The conscious movements of its own limbs could also be recorded in it. It would discover, in trying to move, that its movements were limited and that it would achieve a more perfect peace by refraining from trying to struggle and change position. It would be impressed with the pleasure of inertia, as opposed to the displeasure of making an effort. And finally, its general position with the knees bent and the chin curved downward would be firmly registered, so that, when in life after birth it assumed that position again, the chord of memory would be struck, and the old feeling of rest would likely return. Now, are you following me so far? Because we've reached a crucial point. We cannot assume that the child has any active mental state before its birth, but we know that its condition is as close to omnipotence, from its point of view, as possible. It breathes, or rather, absorbs oxygen without any respiratory effort. It is fed, kept warm and comfortable without any effort. It lives in a world entirely its own, where everything works together for its comfort and well-being. It doesn't need to struggle for existence. It doesn't need to deal with anything real, except perhaps that its voluntary movements are limited. And here we see the beginning of what we all possess in adult life: inertia, the difficulty of starting anything, the objection we have to making efforts. Can you see how this pattern is established so early? Now let's see what happens to this little omnipotent creature at birth. It goes through the probably painful process of having its position abruptly changed and being thrown into a cold and unfamiliar atmosphere. Furthermore, it has to make its first struggle to breathe, its first effort to sustain existence. And in this struggle to breathe, it emits cries, which by experience it soon discovers are magical sounds that allow it to fulfill its desires. After its first abrupt awakening, it is wrapped in something warm, returning to a resemblance to the womb, by having something around it that protects it from the cold. It is gently rocked from side to side by the nurse or other caregiver, and again the resemblance of the previous rocking in the womb is returned to it. Humming sounds are murmured over it, and the resemblance is even more complete. Often it raises its knees a little and falls asleep, achieving as close as possible once again the resemblance of its prenatal condition, where it has no worries and is warm and comfortable. Can you imagine how this affects the psychic development of this child? Although it has become accustomed to some effort, its feeling of omnipotence has not yet been significantly disturbed. The world it has entered differs only slightly from the world it left. It is still a world in which the baby is the center and ruler, in which each of its needs is met without significant effort on its part, except that sometimes it may have to draw attention to its needs through that magical cry that it soon learns how and when to use, and which acts in a truly magical way by fulfilling all its desires. During the first few weeks of the baby's life, this illusion is largely maintained. Few people believe there is any harm in attending to all of a baby's desires in the first month of life. They don't think it's wrong to spoil it at this age, as its intellect hasn't yet developed. But they completely forget that its mental condition and attitude toward life can be inevitably affected during this period. Therefore, whenever the baby cries, it's not uncommon for it to be rocked to sleep or fed, or if it extends something that demonstrates a desire to possess, it is immediately allowed to have it and play with it. It needs to make only the faintest attempts to adjust to its environment, needs to face only the slightest reality. All its desires are immediately satisfied, and it can remain for a considerable period as close to being an omnipotent creature as is possible for any living being. This is fascinating, isn't it? But there's something even deeper that I need to share with you. Its omnipotence is actually a fallacy, or as I prefer to call it at a slightly later stage, a fantasy. The world in which it lived before birth, which seemed like a world to it, wasn't really a world, but a very small and temporary dwelling. And the world in which it lives during the first few months after birth isn't really a world, but a combination of extremely limited and carefully selected portions of the real world, in which all attempts are made to disguise the realities. So let's emphasize again the fact that the main effort the child has to make is the effort of crying, and it learns very quickly that this is so powerful as to practically erase the unpleasant task of having to adapt to the realities of life. This process is carried out with small modifications for many months. The baby need only wave a kind of magic wand, emit a little magical noise from its mouth, and the whole world it knows is set in motion to give it satisfaction and recover some resemblance to its prenatal omnipotence. If you're following along so far, you're about to discover something crucial about adult human behavior. This crying that brings gratification, if it has been truly effective for a very prolonged period, will tend to permanently fix in the child's mind the fact that crying or making a magical noise with the mouth will always bring gratification. And although at a later stage the conscious mind is forced to accept a considerable share of reality and reject the idea of omnipotence, the unconscious mind will persist in the struggle and make futile efforts to forget reality, to transform it into fantasy and to recover its omnipotent state. Now we come to a revealing point. When a man swears because some task of his has not resulted in success, he is in fact repeating the baby's cry. He is emitting a magical sound that his unconscious hopes might somehow remedy the failure. He has not definitely accepted the reality of failure as a commonplace and difficult fact of life at the moment he utters his swear word. When a person cries over some unpleasant event, or with anger over something that has hurt their pride, exactly the same thing is happening. They have failed to completely adapt to the facts and realities of life. They have obeyed the law of regression and returned to the infantile method of expression, crying with the unconscious hope that magical compensation will result, that instead of having to adapt to the facts of life will somehow adapt to their fantasy. Now, if you're wondering how to deal with this in young children, here's valuable guidance. From the earliest possible moment, parents should teach the baby to understand that magical cries will not immediately produce the expected results. The first week of the baby's life is of paramount importance in this regard. The choice of nurse responsible for this period should be made with great care, and one should insist on what is expected of her. The child should be fed at regular and appropriate intervals and kept warm. But if it cries, as happens naturally, it should be left alone for a time. It should not be immediately picked up, rocked to sleep, given another meal, or caressed. If it is left crying for appropriate periods, it will learn very quickly and at the right moment in its life that the sounds it emits are not magical, and it will begin to adapt to the fact that it lives in a real world that was not built solely and exclusively for its own delight. It is curious to note how regression, this instinct to return to the previous mode of expression, to return apparently even to the prenatal state, persists in the unconscious mind. I can share fascinating examples of this. During the war, I met a young man who was intensely agitated by air raids. He felt perfectly safe, however, if he could crawl under the bed or table, where he would curl up practically in the same position as a normal baby before birth. When questioned, he had not the slightest conscious knowledge of why he felt safe in such curious circumstances. But it doesn't seem unlikely that the association of ideas produced by his position and the confined space created a sensation similar to that of security he had in his omnipotent prenatal position, where nothing could harm him. A similar sense of security was experienced by many normal people in basements and other confined spaces during bombings, and probably had the same origin, for there is no doubt that this security was felt, even though their reason told them that a bomb was just as likely to hit their confined space as any other place in the vicinity. Have you noticed how frightened children often cover themselves with sheets? The same mechanism is at work. Returning to our narcissistic baby, we are impressed by the fact that something of the utmost importance in the first years of its life is that it will gradually come into contact with reality, discover that not everything belongs to it, that its omnipotent feelings are based purely on fantasy and not on reality, and on the method of its disillusionment and the age at which it begins depend largely the future powers of adaptation of the child to its environment. It has now become obvious that the newborn lives in a world of fantasy, in which the relative importance of itself in relation to external things is not only distorted, but completely absent. And if we can imagine a child artificially kept in this condition until reaching adulthood, with all desires instantly satisfied, all the forces it knows directed entirely toward the satisfaction of its immediate desires, we don't need much imagination to understand how absolutely helpless and lost this omnipotent creature would be if, suddenly, it were brought into the world to face life and reality. Its only desire would be to return to its omnipotent state, its only effort to keep reality at a distance and transform it into the pleasant fantasy of the previous 20 years. For it would certainly, before its disillusionment, have actually come to believe that it was omnipotent, the only real thing in a world of fantasy that it itself created and dreamed. An extreme case of this kind is, obviously, an impossibility. But there are many and varied degrees in which it can be approached. Probably the closest approach can be found in cases where some kind of moral or mental conflict was too much for an extremely narcissistic mind, which then regressed completely, refused to recognize the outside world, and developed a certain form of insanity. From this stage of complete narcissistic regression, all degrees and types of manifestations of it can be found, until we reach the other extreme of our list, to a person who expects everyone around them to consult their wishes and peculiarities, or who is only a little impatient or prone to irritability, or simply hypersensitive to mental or physical pain. Can you now visualize how this process manifests in your own life or in the people around you? Is it starting to make sense why certain people seem so self-centered? There is no more certain fact than this. If a child is allowed to postpone its knowledge of reality for too long, it will become fixed to a greater or lesser degree in conditions in which fantasy plays a very prominent role, and some kind of regression will occur when it encounters real difficulties. This insight into narcissism and its prenatal and infant origins can completely transform your understanding of human development and the roots of our adult behaviors. By understanding that our emotional reactions are often regressions to an infantile state of omnipotence, we can begin to develop greater awareness and emotional maturity. If this content was enlightening for you, don't forget to share it with friends and family who might benefit from this knowledge. Leave your comment below, telling if you were able to identify narcissistic behaviors that might be related to these primitive patterns of development. Subscribe to the channel for more profound content on human development and psychology, and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next video about how to establish healthy boundaries with narcissistic people. Remember, understanding the origin of our behaviors is the first step to transforming them. Thank you for watching until the end, and we'll see you in the next video.